and adulation he deserves.
It's like unconquered territory.
On August 9, 1986, more than 120,000 people packed into a field in the English countryside to watch Freddie Mercury do something he had done 1,000 times before, walk out in front of a sold-out crowd and own every single second of it. Nobody in that crowd knew it would be the last time they'd ever see him perform live. Nobody backstage knew it either, not really. But somewhere in the middle of that performance, away from the cameras, away from the parts of the story that usually get told, something happened that most retellings leave out entirely. A member of the band nearly lost control in front of the crew. Somewhere out in that massive crowd, a young fan's night ended in tragedy. And Freddie Mercury, the most magnetic performer of his generation, left the stage that night and did something his closest friends said he never did. He didn't celebrate. This is what actually happened at Knebworth Park, and why it still feels like the end of something far bigger than a concert. Before we dig into it, if you're new here, this is exactly the kind of story we dig into every week, the real moments hiding behind the legends everyone thinks they already know. So if that's your thing, go ahead and hit subscribe, drop a like on this video, and let us know in the comments what Queen's song means the most to you. It genuinely helps us keep making these. Now, let's get into it to understand why that night carried so much weight. You have to understand who Freddie Mercury was long before he became the man strutting across that enormous stage. He was born in 1946 on the island of Zanzibar, off the coast of East Africa, into a Parsi family that practiced Zoroastrianism, one of the oldest religions in the world. As a child, he was sent to a boarding school near Mumbai, where teachers noticed something unusual in him almost immediately, a natural ear for music and a stage presence that seemed far too confident for a shy, introverted kid. He formed his first band there before he was even a teenager, mixing the rock and roll he loved with the Bollywood music and soaring vocal styles he grew up around, a blend of influences that would later become part of what made his sound so distinct. When political unrest forced his family to flee Zanzibar in the mid-1960s, they resettled in England, and Freddie enrolled in art college, eventually developing a genuine talent for graphic design, skills he'd later use to design Queen's Snow iconic crest logo himself. It was at art school that he crossed paths with two musicians from a band called Smile, and when that band's singer left in 1970, Freddie stepped in. He's the one who pushed for the new name. Something bold. Something that sounded less like a band and more like a statement. Queen. Success didn't come immediately. Their first two albums barely registered on the charts. It wasn't until their third record that things started to shift, and by 1975, with the release of an ambitious, genre-defying single that mixed a ballad, a mock operatic section, and a full rock finale into one nearly 6-minute song, Queen became something the music industry hadn't really seen before. Radio executives thought it was commercial suicide. It became one of the best-selling singles in British chart history instead. From there, Queen built an identity around doing the things other bands were too cautious to try: theatrical stage shows, wildly ambitious music videos, and a frontman who treated every performance like it might be his last great chance to give an audience something unforgettable. By the mid-1980s, that approach had already produced one of the most legendary moments in music history. Queen's set at Live Aid in the summer of 1985. Watched by an estimated audience of well over 1 billion people, the 20-minute set is still widely regarded as one of the greatest live performances ever captured on television, and it reignited the band's career at a moment when some critics had started writing them off. So when Queen set out on what would become known as the Magic Tour the following year, expectations were enormous. Tickets for their Wembley Stadium shows sold out so fast that promoters scrambled to add more dates. One of those extra dates was a massive outdoor show at Knebworth Park, a sprawling estate north of London with enough open ground to hold well over 100,000 people. It would turn out to be the final date of the tour, and the final time Freddie Mercury would ever stand in front of a live audience with Queen. The scale of that final show was almost absurd for the era. Some estimates put the crowd as high as 200,000 people, making it one of the largest paying audiences for a rock concert Britain had ever seen. Fans camped outside the gates the night before just to guarantee a spot near the front. The stage setup was enormous even by Queen's already over-the-top standards, built for a band that had spent over a decade perfecting the art of turning a concert into spectacle. When Freddie walked out that evening, the noise from the crowd was reportedly loud enough that people in nearby towns could hear it. What most fans watching from the crowd that night didn't know was that Freddie wasn't at full strength. He'd reportedly been dealing with vocal strain and exhaustion in the lead-up to the show, the toll of a grueling tour schedule that had pushed the band across multiple countries in a matter of weeks. There were also quieter, stranger moments in the weeks before Nebworth that, in hindsight, read very differently than they did at the time. Bandmates would later recall offhand comments Freddie made, almost jokes, about not always being around, about there being a point where running around a stage the way he did would eventually stop making sense for him. Nobody took them seriously in the moment. They were the kind of things an exhausted performer says at the tail end of a long tour. Nobody around him had any reason yet to think they meant something more. Whatever was going on beneath the surface, Freddie gave the Nebworth crowd everything he had. The setlist that night ran through nearly the entire arc of Queen's career, from their earliest material to the songs that had made them one of the biggest bands on the planet. He led the audience through massive sing-alongs, played with the crowd between songs, and leaned into the more vulnerable, almost mournful material in the set with a kind of intensity that longtime fans noticed even before anyone understood why. One particular song that night, a slower, more reflective track about mortality and the desire to live forever, has been singled out by people who were there as one of the most quietly devastating moments of the entire set, Freddie performing it not as a rock star putting on a show, but as something far more personal. But the parts of that night that rarely make it into the highlight reels are the parts that actually explain why Nebworth feels less like a celebration in hindsight and more like the closing of a chapter nobody saw coming. Partway through the set, after one of the band's biggest hits, something happened with John Deacon, the band's normally reserved low-key bassist, that caught the entire crew off guard. According to people who worked closely with the band, Deacon, a musician known for staying calm and steady even during chaotic tours, smashed his bass guitar into his own amplifier in a moment of raw frustration. Nobody around him could fully explain why. It wasn't anger at his equipment, and it wasn't anger at anyone else on stage. People who were there that night have since described it as one of the only times in over a decade with the band that Deacon visibly lost his composure in front of everyone. Out in the crowd, something far more serious was unfolding, something that almost never gets mentioned when people talk about Nebworth as a triumphant farewell. Amid the crush of well over 100,000 people, a confrontation broke out, and a young fan lost his life that night, a death that was barely covered in the wave of celebratory press coverage that followed the show. When Freddie Mercury learned what had happened, he was reportedly shaken in a way people close to him rarely saw. He's been quoted as saying that if people had to die just to see the band perform, he didn't want to keep doing it live anymore, a haunting statement from a man who, within months, would quietly begin stepping back from the relentless touring schedule that had defined his entire adult life. By the time the final notes of the night rang out, Freddie closed the show the way he always did on that tour, draped in a royal robe and crowned for the encore, bidding the crowd good night in his usual theatrical style. From the outside, it looked like exactly what it was supposed to be, a triumphant ending to a wildly successful tour. But backstage, something felt different. People who worked with the band that night have said Freddie left almost immediately after the final song, skipping the kind of relaxed, lingering celebration he usually loved after a big show. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a visible breakdown. It was just quieter than usual, a small detail that nobody thought much of in the moment, but that several people around him would later look back on differently. There's another layer to that night that becomes clearer once you understand the people closest to Freddie off stage. Long before Nebworth, in the late 1960s, he'd fallen in love with a woman named Mary Austin, and the two lived together and were even engaged for a time. In the mid-1970s, Freddie told her the truth about his sexuality, and rather than the relationship ending in heartbreak, it transformed into something that lasted the rest of his life. Mary remained one of his closest confidants right up until the end, and he later left her a substantial portion of his estate, including his home, a reflection of just how much he trusted her above almost anyone else. By the time of Nebworth, Freddie was in a long-term relationship with Jim Hutton, a partner who would stay by his side through the hardest years that followed. Freddie rarely discussed his personal life publicly, often deflecting questions with humor rather than direct answers, a habit shaped by growing up in an era when being open about his sexuality carried real legal and social risk in much of the world. That same instinct toward privacy is part of what makes his decision to hide his diagnosis for so long feel less like secrecy for its own sake, and more like a lifelong pattern of protecting the people he loved from a world that hadn't always been kind to him. By the mid-1980s, that same private intensity had also started to strain relationships within the band itself. Touring at the pace Queen kept up throughout the early part of the decade had worn everyone down, and tensions occasionally spilled into the open, arguments in the studio, members walking away from sessions to clear their heads, the kind of friction that happens when four people have spent over a decade living in each other's pockets. By most accounts, those tensions had largely settled by the time of the Magic Tour, replaced by something closer to a shared understanding that what they'd built together was bigger than any one disagreement. That's part of what makes the small cracks that showed up at Knebworth so notable. This wasn't a band falling apart on stage. It was four people who had weathered years of pressure together, suddenly facing something none of them had words for yet. Despite playing to one of the largest crowds of their career, the show that turned out to be Freddie Mercury's final bow with the band wasn't properly captured on camera the way you'd expect for a moment that significant. What exists are partial recordings, audience bootlegs, and fragments, which only adds to the strange, almost mythical weight the show carries today. The band didn't know they were saying goodbye. The cameras certainly didn't either, and in the months that followed, Queen quietly stepped back from touring altogether, something that, at the time, was framed publicly as band members wanting to focus on solo projects and studio work. They would never explain it that way to the public, but the timing lines up with what we now understand. Freddie's health was already changing. He would receive an official HIV diagnosis until the following year, but some of the earliest warning signs reportedly date back even further than that. For the next several years, Freddie kept the diagnosis almost entirely private, sharing it with only a small circle of people he trusted completely, even as tabloids speculated relentlessly about his weight loss and changing appearance. What's remarkable, looking back, is how much music he still managed to create during that period. Queen continued recording new albums throughout the late 1980s and into 1991, with Freddie pushing through vocal sessions even as his health visibly declined. One of the most famous studio stories from that era involves a song built around the idea of pushing forward no matter what, where Freddie, despite serious doubts from his own bandmates about whether he physically could still hit the demanding vocal parts, reportedly knocked back a shot for courage, told everyone in the room he'd handle it, and then delivered the vocal in a single take that left the entire studio stunned. It would become one of the most quietly powerful performances of his career, recorded by a man who, by that point, almost certainly knew exactly how limited his remaining time was. He kept that secret from the wider world until literally one day before his death. On November 23, 1991, Freddie Mercury released a short public statement confirming what tabloids had been speculating about for years, that he had been diagnosed with AIDS. He died the very next day, November 24, 1991, at his home in London, with people closest to him by his side. He was 45 years old. When you put it all together, Knebworth stops looking like just another triumphant stop on a wildly successful world tour. It becomes something closer to a man instinctively giving everything he had left to the people who loved him most, while carrying weight that almost nobody around him fully understood yet. The cracks in his bandmates' composure that night, the real tragedy unfolding somewhere out in that enormous crowd, Freddie's uncharacteristically quiet exit afterward, none of it was part of the story people told about that night for years. But taken together, it paints a far more complicated, far more human picture of what actually happened the last time Freddie Mercury ever stepped on a stage. Maybe that's the part of this story that deserves more attention than the spectacle. Behind one of the most legendary final performances in music history was a band quietly fraying at the edges, a crowd that experienced real loss alongside the celebration, and a frontman who, even while hiding an illness that would take his life just over 5 years later, still found a way to give over 100,000 strangers a night they'd never forget. That's the part of the legend that rarely makes it into the highlight reels, and maybe it's the part that matters most. So here's something worth sitting with. We remember Knebworth as the night a legend took his final bow, but almost nobody in that crowd knew it was an ending at all. How many of the biggest moments in our own lives are quietly happening right now, without any of us realizing it until much later? If you enjoyed this look behind one of music history's most legendary nights, do us a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this video reach more people. Subscribe if you want more deep dives like this one, share it with another Queen fan who needs to hear this story, and let us know in the comments what you think Freddie Mercury would want people to remember most about him. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.